In Harlem, decisions weren't made with shouting, they were made with silence. One quiet click cut through the room. That alley wasn't just dark, it was judging him. The pressure was inches away, but Elijah didn't flinch. On that table wasn't just a weapon, it was Harlem's future, a community center.
Harlem didn't sleep in those years. It watched. It watched from barbershop mirrors and church steps, from the shine of shoes on Lenox Avenue and the steam rising off manhole covers like the city was breathing through cracked lips. It watched through the faces of men who smiled too fast and women who learned to keep their eyes calm even when their hearts were running. And it watched Elijah Carter. Back then, Elijah wasn't famous. Nobody wrote his name in the newspapers. Nobody chanted it in stadiums. If you asked 10 people on the block who Elijah was, 8 would shrug and 2 might say, "Tall guy, quiet, walks like he's carrying something heavy." They would be right. Elijah carried a lot, not in his hands, but behind his ribs, where memory sits when it doesn't want to leave. He'd grown up in Georgia, in a town where the air felt like it had rules, the kind of rules you didn't read, you felt them every time you stepped into the wrong space, asked the wrong question, or stood too straight. His mother, Lottie, used to tell him, "Baby, your dignity is yours. Don't hand it away just because somebody demands it." His father died early, and Elijah learned what it meant to become a man on short notice. He learned to split wood, to fix broken hinges, to keep his younger sister fed when the pantry got thin. He learned that hunger wasn't only about food. Sometimes it was about respect, about safety, about being seen as fully human. When he was 17, an older boy tried to take his sister's necklace, a little gold cross their mother had given her. Elijah didn't think, he didn't plan, he just moved like a storm moves. The fight was short, ugly, and loud. When it ended, Elijah was shaking so hard he could barely stand. Not because he'd lost, because he'd won. That was the first time Elijah understood a truth nobody explains to young men. Winning a violent moment can still feel like losing a piece of your soul. He left Georgia not long after that. The North was a rumor in those days, a rumor that you could work and breathe and not be swallowed by somebody else's hatred, a rumor that the streets had opportunity instead of fear. Harlem welcomed him with noise. Music spilled from doorways, laughter bounced off brick. People walked with a kind of purpose Elijah had never seen, heads high, shoulders squared, like they were daring the world to deny them. But Harlem also had shadows. There were corners where whispers lived, where eyes measured you, where the wrong handshake could become your last mistake. Elijah found work where he could, unloading trucks, sweeping a theater, hauling crates in the back of a club. His hands got rough, his back got stronger, his face stayed the same, calm, unreadable, like he was saving all his words for something important. In time, that quiet became his reputation. In Harlem, quiet men were rarely ignored. They were either feared, respected, or watched carefully, sometimes all three. One winter night, Elijah was working security at a small venue where jazz didn't just play, it confessed. The club was cramped and warm, the kind of place where people came to forget the city's cold truth for a few hours. Elijah stood near the entrance, scanning faces, counting hands, reading body language the way some men read scripture. That night, a commotion rippled through the crowd. A few men moved too quickly. A few heads turned too sharply. Elijah stepped forward, ready to break up whatever was brewing, when a voice behind him said, low and controlled, "Don't rush, young blood. Let it show itself." Elijah turned. The man wasn't tall, but he carried height anyway, the kind that comes from confidence that doesn't need permission. His suit looked expensive without trying. His eyes were steady. There was no swagger, just certainty. Elijah had seen that face before, not in person, but in the way people spoke about him. and the way conversations went softer when his name came up. Bumpy Johnson. Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson wasn't just a figure in Harlem, he was a weather system. People had opinions about him like they had opinions about storms. Some hated what he could do, some were grateful for what he protected, and most simply respected his power enough to not stand in his way. Bumpy looked Elijah up and down like he was reading a book with no title. "You work this door?" Bumpy asked. "Yes, sir." "You don't drink on the job?" "No, sir." "You don't talk much?" "I talk when it matters." Bumpy's mouth twitched like it wanted to smile, but didn't trust the world with it. "Come walk with me." Elijah didn't move right away. In Harlem, you learned that invitations from powerful men were rarely simple. Bumpy noticed the hesitation and nodded once. "Smart, but I'm not asking twice." Elijah followed. They stepped outside into the cold. The city air slapped Elijah's cheeks. A car idled nearby, sleek and dark. A driver sat behind the wheel, eyes forward. Bumpy walked slowly, hands behind his back, like he was taking a stroll instead of making a decision. "Tell me something," Bumpy said. "Why you stand like that?" Elijah blinked. "Like what?"
Like you expect the world to swing at you. Elijah swallowed. "Because it does." Bumpy's eyes stayed on the street. "And when it swings, what do? I don't fall." That earned a real smile. Small, sharp, but real. "Harlem's full of men who want to look dangerous," Bumpy said. "You don't look dangerous. You look prepared. I like prepared." Elijah didn't reply. Bumpy stopped and finally looked at him. "You got a mother?" "Yes." "You take care of her?" "I send money when I can." "You got any habits?" "No." "You got any vices?" Elijah hesitated. "I got anger." Bumpy nodded like he appreciated honesty. "Anger is fuel," Bumpy said, "but you don't drive a car by pouring gas on the seat. You pour it where it belongs. You control it." Elijah stared ahead. "Why are you talking to me?" Bumpy held the gaze of the street like the street owed him answers. "Because I need a man who can stand next to me and not get drunk on the idea of it." Elijah's throat tightened. "What would the work be?" Bumpy turned slightly, enough that the streetlight caught the lines in his face, lines carved by choices and consequences. "Protection," Bumpy said. "Not trouble, protection." Elijah knew better than to believe the world was that clean. But he also knew something else. In Harlem, power existed whether you accepted it or not. The question wasn't whether power was there. The question was whether you'd survive around it. "I'll think about it," Elijah said. Bumpy laughed softly. "You already did." And then, like that, the decision was set in motion. Elijah became part of Bumpy's world the way a man becomes part of a storm, not by choosing the wind, but by stepping into the sky when the clouds are already gathering. At first it was simple. Ride along, stand nearby, watch the door, scan the crowd. Bumpy moved through Harlem like a man with a map nobody else could see. He knew who was hungry, who was desperate, who was pretending. He knew which police officers were honest and which ones wore their badges like masks. He knew which preachers meant their prayers and which ones used God as a business plan. What surprised Elijah most was how often Bumpy spoke about books. One evening they sat in a back room of a bar after closing. The air smelled of smoke and lemon peel. Bumpy held a worn paperback in his hand as if it mattered. "You read?" Elijah said. "I can. Don't do it much." "You should. A man who can't control his mind is a man whose body will end up controlled by somebody else." Elijah watched him. "You read philosophy?" Bumpy shrugged. "I read what helps me think." Elijah didn't know what to do with that. He expected bragging. He expected cruelty. Instead, he saw a man who carried weight and seemed to know exactly what it cost. But cost is never quiet for long. One day, Bumpy's driver took Elijah to a gym on 125th. The place smelled like sweat and hope. Man worked bags with desperate rhythm, as if punching could change their futures. On the wall were posters, fighters, champions, faces built from discipline. And then Elijah saw him, Joe Louis. Not in a poster, not in a magazine, in flesh and breath, moving with controlled power as he worked with a trainer. His shoulders rolled like machinery. His eyes were calm, focused. Every punch looked like it had a purpose beyond violence. Joe Louis was more than a boxer to people in Harlem. He was evidence. He was a living, breathing maybe to a world that wanted to say never. Elijah felt something catch in his chest. Bumpy came up beside him and watched Joe Louis train. "That man," Bumpy said quietly, "is a sermon without a pulpit." Elijah nodded. "He's different." Joe Louis finished a round and stepped away to wipe his face. When he noticed Bumpy, he walked over. There was respect between them. Complicated, cautious, real. "Bumpy," Joe Louis said, "didn't expect to see you here. Had to check on you. People watch you, some for love, some for money, some for the wrong reasons." Joe Louis glanced at Elijah. "Who's that?" Bumpy's eyes flicked towards Elijah. "That," Bumpy said, "is Elijah. He don't talk much, but he hears everything." Joe Louis extended his hand. Elijah shook it. Joe Louis's grip was firm, but not crushing, strong without needing to prove it. His eyes held something Elijah recognized, the weight of representing more than yourself. "I heard you from Georgia." Elijah's face tightened. "How?" Joe Louis smiled faintly. "We hear everything in this world, brother, especially what we need to hear." Elijah wasn't sure what to say. Joe Louis stepped closer, voice dropping. "I don't know what kind of work you doing with Bumpy," he said, careful, respectful, "but don't lose yourself in it. Harlem doesn't need more ghosts." That sentence hit Elijah harder than any punch could have. Harlem doesn't need more ghosts. Joe Louis went back to training, and Elijah stood frozen, feeling like he'd been warned by a man who had learned how to survive spotlight heat. On the ride back, Bumpy said nothing for a long time. Then, as if speaking to the window, he said, "Joe Louis is right." Elijah turned. "About what?" "About ghosts," Bumpy said, his voice suddenly older. "We make too many of them." Elijah didn't ask what that meant. Some answers came with pain attached, and Elijah was learning to read when pain was about to enter the room. Days passed, then weeks. Winter softened into a damp spring. Harlem stayed Harlem, beautiful, bruised, hungry, proud. And then the trouble arrived wearing a smile. A man named Victor Lasky started showing up in Harlem with clean shoes and dirty intentions. He wasn't from the neighborhood, but he walked through it like he owned it. He spoke with promises in one hand and threats in the other. He wanted pieces of the city that weren't for sale. The first time Elijah saw him, Lasky was in a back office with Bumpy. Elijah stood near the door like a shadow with eyes. Lasky looked at Elijah and smirked. "Big guy. You always keep him around?" Bumpy didn't react. "I keep what keeps me alive." Lasky laughed. "I like you, Bumpy. You're old school, but the world is changing. Harlem is changing. It's gonna need new management." Bumpy's eyes were calm. Harlem doesn't belong to managers. It belongs to people. Lasky leaned forward, grin sharp. "People are expensive." Bumpy smiled back, cold as winter. "Then don't shop here." The room went quiet. Elijah watched Lasky's hands. He watched his eyes. He watched the way he sat, too comfortable, like he didn't fear consequences. That was always the most dangerous kind of man, the one who believed he would never pay. When Lasky left, Bumpy stayed seated, staring at the desk as if it had become a mirror. Elijah waited. Finally, Bumpy spoke. "You hear how he talked?" "Yes." "What did you hear underneath it?" Elijah chose his words carefully. "He's not negotiating." Bumpy nodded once. "He's declaring." Bumpy stood, adjusted his coat, and looked at Elijah. People think power is loud, but real power is a whisper. It doesn't shout because it doesn't need permission. Elijah felt a chill. "What do you want me to do?" Bumpy held Elijah's gaze longer than usual. "I want you to stay awake." And Elijah understood. The storm was moving closer. The next week, the city felt wrong. The air didn't shift, but the energy did. Men on corners watched longer. Cars idled too long near certain buildings. People started avoiding certain streets, not because they knew something, but because instinct is sometimes wiser than information. Elijah noticed a pattern. Unfamiliar faces, always in pairs, always watching Bumpy's movements from a distance. Not just the cops, these were different. Their shoes were too clean for Harlem's sidewalks. Their eyes were too flat. One night, Bumpy attended a community event, a small fundraiser for a local youth program. It wasn't glamorous. There were folding chairs, cheap coffee, plates of cookies that tasted like somebody's grandmother had tried her best. The kind of event that wouldn't make headlines. That's why Bumpy went, because Harlem was more than headlines. Elijah stood near the sidewall, scanning the room. He watched the doors, the windows, the hands. He watched the way people smiled when Bumpy greeted them, not like fans, but like neighbors who were grateful someone powerful still recognized them. Then Elijah heard something, a sound that didn't belong. Not a shout, not a scream, a soft metallic click. It came from near the back of the room. Elijah's whole body tightened like a wire pulled too hard. His eyes snapped towards the sound. For a fraction of a second, he saw a man's hand move under a coat. Time did something strange in that moment. It didn't slow.
The weight of an echo. The night didn't end when the sirens arrived. It only changed clothes. Harlem has a way of turning a single moment into a neighborhood-wide heartbeat. And by the time Elijah and Bumpy slipped into the car, the city already felt like it was listening to itself. The driver pulled away smoothly, tires whispering over wet pavement, while the red and blue reflections chased them across shop windows and street puddles like restless ghosts. Elijah sat in the back seat with his shoulders squared, but inside him everything was shaking, not the way a scared man shakes, but the way a man shakes when he realizes he will never be the same version of himself again. His ears still held that sharp, final sound like a splinter lodged deep under skin, and he hated that his mind kept replaying the instant before it happened, the click that warned him, the fraction of a second where two futures competed for the right to exist. Bumpy stared out the window the whole ride, jaw tight, expression calm in a way that didn't comfort Elijah at all, because he understood that calm like that wasn't peace, it was discipline, built from too many nights where emotion would have gotten you buried. They reached a quieter street and parked near a building that didn't look like much, but Elijah knew better now than to judge Harlem by appearances. Inside, Bumpy moved through the hallway without turning on the overhead lights, as if even electricity could betray you, and Elijah followed with the same quiet awareness he'd used at doors and corners, except now the danger wasn't just outside, it was inside his chest. Bumpy poured 2 glasses of water in a small kitchen and slid one across the table. Elijah held the glass but didn't drink because his throat felt too tight for anything to pass through it, and because he was afraid that if he swallowed, he'd also swallow the reality of what had happened, and it would settle permanently in his stomach like a stone. Bumpy sat across from him, fingers folded, and for a long time neither of them spoke, not because there was nothing to say, but because the right words were expensive and neither man wanted to spend them wrong. When Bumpy finally broke the silence, his voice came out low and even, as if he was trying to keep Elijah's mind from tipping over an edge.
He told Elijah the truth in the simplest way, that people would talk, the police would come with questions they already thought they knew the answers to, and Victor Lasky would treat tonight as both a warning and an invitation, because men like Lasky didn't fear consequences the way decent people did. They studied consequences like chessboards. Elijah nodded, but his nod wasn't agreement so much as survival instinct. The part of him that still believed he could be good in a world this sharp was trying to breathe, and he didn't know yet whether it would make it through the night. By morning, Harlem's rumor machine had done what it always did. It turned complexity into headlines and pain into entertainment. Elijah walked past a corner store and saw two men talking with their hands, drawing invisible diagrams in the air, shaping their version of the story into something bold and simple enough to repeat. In one version, Elijah was a hero who saved Bumpy from a setup and protected the community. In another, he was a cold enforcer who brought violence into a place meant for children and families. In both versions, Elijah wasn't a human being, he was a symbol people could argue about. That's what shook him most. He had expected fear and guilt, but he hadn't expected to feel invisible while everyone said his name. On the block, a woman he barely knew pressed a bag of hot rolls into his hands, as if kindness could patch the hole in his spirit. And she didn't ask what happened, didn't demand a confession, only said, "Eat something, baby. You look like you've been carrying night on your back." Elijah thanked her and walked on, feeling the warmth of the bread like a small mercy, the kind the world doesn't always offer men who live near power. The police came later that day, not in a dramatic swarm, but in measured steps, because authority likes to pretend it is always in control, even when it isn't. Two detectives knocked with the politeness of men who already had their conclusions tucked into their pockets. They asked Elijah where he was last night, what he saw, what he heard, and why he was always standing near Bumpy Johnson like a shadow with legs. Their questions didn't feel like a search for truth. They felt like an attempt to shape truth into something convenient. Elijah answered carefully, not because he was hiding guilt, but because he had learned that in some rooms, honesty is treated like weakness, and weakness gets punished. Bumpy arrived mid-interview, placed himself between Elijah and the detectives with a calm smile that didn't reach his eyes, and reminded them of something they hated hearing, that Harlem knew how to protect its own stories, and not every question deserves an answer. When the detectives left, one of them turned at the door and said, almost casually, "Tell your boy to watch himself. Everybody's watching now." The words were meant as a threat, but they landed as a prophecy, and Elijah felt his stomach drop because he understood what it meant when the world starts watching. Watching is rarely passive. Watching is how predators pick their moment. That evening, Bumpy took Elijah to a small church not far from the avenue, the kind of church where the wooden pews were worn smooth by generations of elbows and prayers. It wasn't Sunday and there wasn't a crowd, but the sanctuary smelled like candles and old hymns, and the air held a quiet that made Elijah's mind feel louder. Bumpy didn't bring him there to perform holiness. He brought him there because even men who live hard lives sometimes need a room where the world can't argue with your thoughts. They sat near the back, and Elijah stared at the stained glass, watching light turn into colors it didn't deserve. Bumpy spoke without looking at him, voice measured as if he was reading from a book only he could see. He told Elijah about the first time he realized power could swallow a man whole if the man didn't build a code stronger than his fear. He said that Harlem had always been forced to build its own rules because the official rules were written without them in mind, and that sometimes protection looks ugly from the outside because outsiders don't understand what it costs to keep a neighborhood from being eaten alive. Elijah listened, but his heart wouldn't unclench. He finally asked the question that had been burning him from the inside since the fundraiser. How do you live with it? Bumpy didn't answer with poetry, he answered with truth. He said, you don't live with it, you carry it, and you decide what kind of man you'll be while you carry it. Then he added something softer, almost fatherly, that surprised Elijah. And you don't carry it alone, not if you want your soul to stay intact.
The next day, Joe Lewis's name floated through Harlem in a different way, not as a poster or a champion, but as a presence. Elijah heard that Joe Louis was doing a small community appearance at a local gym. Nothing glamorous, just a visit and a few words for young fighters who needed proof that discipline could pull you out of any pit. Elijah didn't want to go. He felt unworthy of clean spaces. He felt like the echo inside him would contaminate the room. But Bumpy told him, with the kind of firmness that wasn't negotiable, that he needed to hear something outside his own head. When they arrived, the gym was packed with boys pretending not to be starstruck, men trying to look tough while their eyes shone like children, and mothers leaning against the walls with pride and worry woven together in their faces. Joe Louis stood near the ring, calm and steady, and when he spoke, he didn't shout. He didn't need volume. He spoke about patience, about training, about how a man's real strength isn't what he can do to another person, but what he can refuse to do when his anger begs him to. He said that fear doesn't make you weak, refusing to face fear does. He said that respect is earned in private long before it is celebrated in public. Elijah stood near the back, feeling those words hit parts of him he didn't know were bleeding. After the talk, when the crowd thinned and people took their final glimpses like they were collecting hope, Joe Louis noticed Elijah. His eyes held recognition, not of a celebrity, but of a man who has seen struggle in another man's posture. Joe Louis walked over, and Elijah's first instinct was to step back, because when you feel stained, you avoid clean light. But Joe Louis didn't treat him like a monster or a hero. He treated him like a human being. He asked quietly, "You sleeping?" Elijah tried to lie, but the truth leaked out. Not really. Joe Louis nodded slowly, as if he'd expected that answer. Then he said something that Elijah would remember longer than any sermon. "Your mind is trying to punish you so you don't become careless. That pain is proof you still got a conscience. Don't lose it." Elijah's eyes burned, but he refused to let tears fall in public. Joe Louis continued, voice low enough that it felt like a personal message, not a performance. "The world will try to label you. Don't let it. You decide who you are by what you do next." Elijah swallowed hard, because next was exactly what terrified him. He wasn't afraid of enemies. He was afraid of becoming the kind of man who stops caring.
Then, just when the tension tightened, something unexpected happened. Reggie himself appeared at the edge of the walkway, breathless, eyes wide with fear. He had followed Elijah, curiosity and worry pulling him like a string. He didn't know he'd walked into danger. He only knew he didn't like the look on the grown men's faces. Elijah's heart dropped. Lasky's smile returned, slow and satisfied, because now the trap had teeth. Elijah took one step toward Reggie, instinct overriding everything. Lasky's man moved as if to block him. Elijah stopped, hands still visible, voice firm but controlled. "Kid, go home." Reggie hesitated, confused. Lasky spoke sweetly, like a serpent wearing a lullaby. "Let the boy watch," he said. "He should learn how the world works." Elijah felt something inside him roar, but he forced it down, refusing to let rage drive the steering wheel. He looked at Reggie and said, slower, clearer, like a big brother issuing a command, "Go home, right now. This ain't your lesson." Reggie's eyes flicked from Elijah to Lasky. He finally backed away, fear winning over curiosity, and ran. That single act, protecting the kid's exit, refusing to turn the moment into a spectacle, changed the temperature of the meeting. Lasky lost the advantage he wanted most, the ability to force Elijah into a public, messy reaction. Lasky's face tightened. He stepped back and muttered something about Elijah being too sentimental. Elijah didn't deny it. He stood in that cold river wind and realized something that surprised him. Sentiment wasn't weakness. Caring wasn't softness. Caring was a refusal to become the kind of man the world expected him to become. Lasky left with his men, but not before delivering a final line that clung to the air like smoke. You think you're choosing a code, but the city chooses for you, sooner or later. Elijah watched them disappear and felt the tremor of truth in that statement. The city did choose sometimes, but not always,
Not completely, not if you fought to keep your soul from being voted on. When Elijah returned, Bumpy didn't scold him, he didn't praise him either. He simply listened, eyes fixed on Elijah's face as if he was measuring whether Elijah had survived the meeting externally and internally. When Elijah described Reggie's appearance, Bumpy's jaw tightened with anger that he controlled the way a man controls a knife, carefully. Elijah expected Bumpy to respond with retaliation, with a plan to strike back hard. Instead, he surprised him again. He said, "Lasky wants blood because blood makes people predictable. Fear makes people sloppy." He leaned forward. "We're not giving him either." Elijah stared. "Then what do we do?" Bumpy's eyes narrowed. "We do what he can't stand." Elijah waited. Bumpy said, "We build something." Elijah frowned. "Build what?" Bumpy's voice softened in a way that felt almost dangerous, because tenderness in their world could get you killed. "Protection that doesn't look like war," Bumpy said. "We help the people he can't buy. We make Harlem less hungry, because hungry neighborhoods are easy to control." Elijah felt something inside him shift, a new kind of purpose rising like dawn through fog. He realized Bumpy was offering him an exit from becoming just a weapon. He was offering him a role as a shield. In the days that followed, Elijah began doing work that didn't appear in rumors. He walked children home from school when unfamiliar cars started circling. He quietly paid a shopkeeper's overdue rent when he heard the landlord was threatening to throw the family out. He stood outside a widow's apartment one night because someone had been knocking on her door late, trying to scare her into moving. He didn't boast about any of it. He didn't want applause. He wanted to feel like the weight inside him could be used for something that didn't rot. People noticed anyway. In Harlem, you can't hide kindness for long because it has a sound too, the softer sound of relief, the sound of somebody realizing they're not alone. An elderly man at the barber shop told Elijah, "You got big shoulders, son. Don't just use them to block bullets. Use them to carry the neighborhood when it's tired." Elijah nodded, feeling that sentence settle into him like another part of his code. But Lasky didn't disappear. Men like him don't retreat, they reposition. The rumors escalated again, this time aimed not at fear, but at doubt. Elijah heard whispers that he was trying to play saint to cover sins, that he was performing kindness to manipulate people, that he was dangerous because he was unpredictable. The saddest part was how quickly people will believe anything when they've been hurt too many times. Elijah could feel the neighborhood's uncertainty like static in the air. He began to understand that social justice wasn't only about grand speeches and courtroom victories. Sometimes it was about earning trust in a place that had been betrayed so often that trust felt foolish. He didn't argue with the rumors. He didn't hunt down mouths that spread them. He simply kept showing up, because showing up is how you break a lie without raising your voice. One night, after a long day of small acts that felt bigger than any dramatic confrontation, Elijah sat alone in his room with the lights low. He stared at his hands again, but this time he wasn't seeing them as instruments of harm. He was seeing them as tools, capable of damage, yes, but also capable of protection, repair, and steadiness. He thought about Joe Louis, about how that man punched for a living, but still spoke about restraint like it was sacred. He thought about his mother, about dignity. He thought about Bumpy, about code. And he finally admitted something out loud, just to himself, voice barely more than breath. "I don't want to be remembered for the sound." The room stayed quiet, but Elijah felt the truth in his bones. He didn't want history to define him by a single echo. He wanted to be defined by what he built afterward. As if the city was testing that vow, Reggie knocked on Elijah's door the next morning, eyes nervous, hands fidgeting. The boy confessed he hadn't told anyone about following Elijah to the river, but he'd been scared ever since, scared that Lasky would punish him for seeing too much. Elijah listened and felt anger rise, not at Reggie, but at the fact that a child had to carry fear like that. Elijah promised him he would be safe, and then he did something no rumor could twist. He took the boy to the gym, introduced him to a trainer, and paid for his membership quietly, telling him, if you're going to learn something, learn discipline. It'll save your life faster than any corner will. Elijah's eyes widened, hope flickering. Elijah didn't smile much, but he put a hand on the kid's shoulder and added, "You got a future, little man. Don't rent it out to anybody." That afternoon, Bumpy received word that Lasky was planning something bigger, a public move meant to embarrass Bumpy, break his influence, and make Harlem feel leaderless so outsiders could step in with solutions that were really chains. Elijah looked at Bumpy and said, "If he wants public, we give him public, but not the kind he expects." Bumpy raised his eyebrow, curious. Elijah explained that the best way to break Lasky's control was to expose him without violence, to show the neighborhood that the man's power was mostly theater, dependent on people believing they were alone. Bumpy listened, silent, then nodded slowly, as if he was witnessing Elijah become something more than a bodyguard. You learnin', you turnin' pain into strategy. Elijah didn't feel proud, he felt determined. Determination is different. Pride swells, determination steadies. That night, Elijah walked Harlem again, but not like a shadow. He walked like a man with purpose that didn't need applause. He stopped at a community center where mothers were organizing food for families hit hard by winter layoffs. He spoke with a pastor about keeping the youth program funded. He visited the gym and watched Reggie practice footwork, clumsy but committed, and he felt something close to peace for the first time in days. Peace didn't erase the echo, but it changed what the echo meant. It turned it from a curse into a reminder. Every loud moment must be followed by a quieter decision to live right. And somewhere across the city, Victor Lasky was planning his next move, convinced that pressure would crack Elijah's code the way pressure cracks cheap glass. But Elijah wasn't cheap glass. He was something forged from Georgia's harsh lessons, Harlem's hard love, Joe Louis's discipline, and a code that refused to worship violence as destiny. Elijah knew the next chapter wouldn't be gentle. He also knew something else now, something powerful enough to stand against fear. He was fighting not just to survive, he was fighting to remain human. When Elijah returned to Bumpy's place near midnight, Bumpy was seated at the table with a few papers spread out, not ledgers of crime, but lists, names of families, notes about rent, plans for donations, details about keeping certain kids away from certain corners. Elijah stared, surprised, and Bumpy met his eyes with a look that carried quiet truth. Harlem is not just a battlefield, it's a home, and if we don't treat it like one, somebody else will treat it like a resource. Elijah sat down, the chair creaking under him, and for the first time since the fundraiser, his chest didn't feel like it was collapsing. It still hurt, the echo was still there, but now the echo had a direction. It was pushing him towards something that felt like redemption. Outside, the city kept breathing. Somewhere, a train rattled. Somewhere, laughter rose from a late-night apartment. Somewhere, a baby cried and was soothed back to sleep. Harlem was still alive, still stubborn, still refusing to be erased.
When a neighborhood refuses to bow. By the time the next week rolled in, Harlem felt like it was standing on the edge of a decision it didn't know it was making, because that's how pressure works in communities that have been squeezed for generations. It doesn't just attack the body, it attacks the spirit. It attacks the belief that you're allowed to stand upright. Elijah noticed it in the smallest details first, the kind of details that don't make headlines, but make lives heavier. Shopkeepers double-locking their doors before sunset, mothers pulling their children a little closer when unfamiliar cars slowed down near the curb, young men arguing louder than necessary because fear was trying to use their mouths as weapons. Lasky's presence wasn't always visible, but his influence was, spreading like a stain through rumor and intimidation, convincing people that resistance was pointless and that power always belonged to outsiders with smoother shoes and colder hearts.
Bumpy understood the pattern as soon as Elijah described it, and the old Harlem strategist inside him stirred, not with panic, but with calculation. He told Elijah that Lasky wasn't trying to win with one big dramatic moment. He was trying to make Harlem tired, because a tired neighborhood stops asking questions, stops organizing, stops imagining alternatives, and when imagination dies, exploitation doesn't even have to hide. That's why Bumpy's table now held papers that looked almost like a social worker's desk, lists of families, notes about rent, names of pastors, gym schedules, youth programs, because the fastest way to break a predator's control is to feed the people he's counting on starving. Elijah felt something strange as he watched Bumpy work, a kind of respect that was deeper than fear, because he was seeing that real power, the kind that lasts, doesn't only protect itself, it protects the future. Still, Elijah also knew their quiet building work was only half the battle, because Lasky didn't fear kindness, he feared unity, and he would try to shatter it the moment it started forming. Lasky struck the way Elijah had begun to expect, not with a punch, but with a story. It happened on a Tuesday afternoon, the kind of gray day where Harlem's colors look muted and the city seems to be holding its breath. Elijah had just left the gym after checking in on Reggie, who was improving fast enough to shock his own confidence, when two officers approached him near the corner and asked him to come down to the station for a few questions. Their voices were casual, but their eyes weren't. Elijah knew immediately this wasn't random. Inside the station, a detective he'd seen before slid a file across a desk and asked Elijah where he'd been the night of a recent robbery that had rattled a local business owner. Elijah stared at the file and felt his stomach tighten, because the witness statement inside didn't just mention his height and build, it mentioned his connection to Bumpy, as if that association alone was proof of guilt. The detective's tone was smooth, almost polite, like he was doing Elijah a favor by offering him a way out if he just cooperated. Elijah stayed calm, answering what he could, refusing what he couldn't, but the deeper sting wasn't in the questions, it was in the realization that someone had started painting him as a villain in public to weaken his credibility before the community could fully trust him. When Elijah stepped outside hours later, Harlem was already buzzing. A man at the newsstand shook his head and muttered, "They say that big quiet one finally showed his true face." A woman on the stoop watched Elijah like she wanted to ask him if it was true, but didn't trust herself to handle the answer. That night, when Elijah came back to Bumpy's place, Bumpy didn't rage or threaten. He listened carefully, then said something that cut deeper than anger. "This is how they separate you from the people. They don't have to destroy you physically if they can isolate you morally." Elijah sat with his hands clasped, fighting the urge to slam his fist into the table, because frustration was begging to become violence, and he refused to feed that hunger. He told Bumpy he could handle being watched, handle being questioned, even handle being hated by strangers, but he couldn't handle being used as a tool to make Harlem distrust itself. Bumpy nodded slowly and said, "Then we don't fight their lie with noise, we fight it with proof. We make our own truth so visible it's hard to bury." Elijah asked what that looked like, and Bumpy's answer came like a plan that had been waiting in his pocket for years. They would host a public community event, not a fundraiser in a small room this time, but a full neighborhood gathering with pastors, shop owners, youth coaches, and respected voices, something too open to quietly sabotage, something designed to show Harlem itself that it had a backbone. Elijah understood the risk immediately, because if Lasky loved anything, it was public pressure. But Bumpy looked at him with a calm certainty that felt like steel under cloth and said, "He wants public to scare us. We'll use public to strengthen us."
The weight of an echo. The night didn't end when the sirens arrived. It only changed clothes. Harlem has a way of turning a single moment into a neighborhood-wide heartbeat. And by the time Elijah and Bumpy slipped into the car, the city already felt like it was listening to itself. The driver pulled away smoothly, tires whispering over wet pavement, while the red and blue reflections chased them across shop windows and street puddles like restless ghosts. Elijah sat in the back seat with his shoulders squared, but inside him everything was shaking. Not the way a scared man shakes, but the way a man shakes when he realizes he will never be the same version of himself again. His ears still held that sharp, final sound like a splinter lodged deep under skin. And he hated that his mind kept replaying the instant before it happened, the click that warned him, the fraction of a second where two futures competed for the right to exist. Bumpy stared out the window the whole ride, jaw tight, expression calm in a way that didn't comfort Elijah at all, because he understood that calm like that wasn't peace. It was discipline built from too many nights where emotion would have gotten you buried. They reached a quieter street and parked near a building that didn't look like much, but Elijah knew better now than to judge Harlem by appearances. Inside, Bumpy moved through the hallway without turning on the overhead lights, as if even electricity could betray you. And Elijah followed with the same quiet awareness he'd used at doors and corners, except now the danger wasn't just outside, it was inside his chest. Bumpy poured 2 glasses of water in a small kitchen and slid one across the table. Elijah held the glass but didn't drink because his throat felt too tight for anything to pass through it, and because he was afraid that if he swallowed, he'd also swallow the reality of what had happened, and it would settle permanently in his stomach like a stone. Bumpy sat across from him, fingers folded, and for a long time neither of them spoke, not because there was nothing to say, but because the right words were expensive, and neither man wanted to spend them wrong. When Bumpy finally broke the silence, his voice came out low and even, as if he was trying to keep Elijah's mind from tipping over an edge. He told Elijah the truth in the simplest way, that people would talk, the police would come with questions they already thought they knew the answers to, and Victor Lasky would treat tonight as both a warning and an invitation, because men like Lasky didn't fear consequences the way decent people did. They studied consequences like chessboards. Elijah nodded, but his nod wasn't agreement so much as survival instinct. The part of him that still believed he could be good in a world this sharp was trying to breathe, and he didn't know yet whether it would make it through the night. By morning, Harlem's rumor machine had done what it always did. It turned complexity into headlines and pain into entertainment. Elijah walked past a corner store and saw 2 men talking with their hands, drawing invisible diagrams in the air, shaping their version of the story into something bold and simple enough to repeat. In one version, Elijah was a hero who saved Bumpy from a setup and protected the community. In another, he was a cold enforcer who brought violence into a place meant for children and families. In both versions, Elijah wasn't a human being, he was a symbol people could argue about. That's what shook him most. He had expected fear and guilt, but he hadn't expected to feel invisible while everyone said his name. On the block, a woman he barely knew pressed a bag of hot rolls into his hands, as if kindness could patch the hole in his spirit. And she didn't ask what happened, didn't demand a confession, only said, "Eat something, baby. You look like you've been carrying night on your back." Elijah thanked her and walked on, feeling the warmth of the bread like a small mercy, the kind the world doesn't always offer men who live near power. The police came later that day, not in a dramatic swarm, but in measured steps, because authority likes to pretend it is always in control, even when it isn't. 2 detectives knocked with the politeness of men who already had their conclusions tucked into their pockets. They asked Elijah where he was last night, what he saw, what he heard, and why he was always standing near Bumpy Johnson like a shadow with legs. Their questions didn't feel like a search for truth. They felt like an attempt to shape truth into something convenient. Elijah answered carefully, not because he was hiding guilt, but because he had learned that in some rooms, honesty is treated like weakness, and weakness gets punished. Bumpy arrived mid-interview, placed himself between Elijah and the detectives with a calm smile that didn't reach his eyes, and reminded them of something they hated hearing, that Harlem knew how to protect its own stories, and that not every question deserves an answer. When the detectives left, one of them turned at the door and said, almost casually, "Tell your boy to watch himself. Everybody's watching now." The words were meant as a threat, but they landed as a prophecy, and Elijah felt his stomach drop because he understood what it meant when the world starts watching. Watching is rarely passive. Watching is how predators pick their moment. A room full of eyes. The night Bumpy warned Elijah about arrived with the kind of cold that makes the city feel sharper, like every corner has an opinion and every shadow is taking notes. Harlem's streets were still alive, but the life carried caution now, as if everyone could sense that something important was about to happen beyond their view. Elijah walked beside Bumpy in silence, not because he had nothing to say, but because he had learned that some nights require your mind to stay uncluttered, like a clean table where only the necessary things belong. The car ride downtown felt longer than it should have, and as the buildings changed, Harlem's familiar brick giving way to taller structures with cleaner windows, Elijah felt the invisible pressure of crossing into a world that wasn't built with his comfort in mind. Bumpy looked calm, almost casual, but Elijah knew that calm was a practiced armor, the kind that lets a man walk into hostile rooms without giving them the satisfaction of seeing him flinch. When they reached the venue, Elijah understood immediately what Bumpy had meant by a place with cameras, money, and people who pretend they don't choose sides. The building glowed from within, all polished marble and soft golden light, and outside the entrance, photographers hovered like mosquitoes around wealth, not interested in truth, only in whatever angle sold. Well-dressed guests stepped out of cars, smiling and laughing as if the city's pain was something happening in another universe, and Elijah felt a familiar anger rise, the anger of seeing comfort treated like character. He swallowed it down, reminding himself of his code, because tonight wasn't about winning a battle with fists or threats. Tonight was about surviving a room that could kill reputations with whispers. Inside, the event looked like a celebration, but Elijah could feel the tension beneath the music because he had learned how to read spaces the way some men read weather. This wasn't just a party, it was a gathering of influence, politicians, business owners, journalists, and wealthy donors who talked about community improvement in the same tone they used to discuss investments. The stage at the far end of the room held a microphone, and banners near the wall referenced youth programs, scholarships, and neighborhood development, all the right words arranged like decorations. Elijah recognized the trick. If you wrap power in charity language, you can make exploitation look like generosity. He moved with Bumpy through the crowd, scanning faces, noting who smiled too hard, who stared too long, who looked like they were waiting for something to go wrong. Then Elijah saw Victor Lasky across the room, dressed sharp, laughing with a small group as if he were a respected figure rather than a predator. Lasky's eyes caught Elijah's for a moment, and his smile widened just slightly, like a man who had successfully baited a hook and was now watching the water for movement. Elijah didn't look away. He held the stare long enough to let Lasky know something important. Intimidation only works when the target agrees to be intimidated. Lasky's smile didn't fade, but his eyes hardened, and Elijah felt the air shift as if the room itself had noticed the conflict. Bumpy didn't head straight toward Lasky. He didn't grant him that importance. Instead, Bumpy moved through the crowd like a man greeting old acquaintances, shaking hands, offering polite words, building a quiet web of presence that reminded everyone Harlem wasn't absent. Harlem had arrived, and Harlem brought its own memory into this polished space. Elijah followed half a step behind, feeling the gaze of strangers flick over him, not seeing him as a person, but as a symbol, because that's what these rooms did. They turned human beings into categories. Some looked at Elijah with suspicion, some with curiosity, and some with the kind of cold interest people reserve for things they can't control. Then a journalist approached with a smile that looked friendly but felt predatory. She asked Bumpy casual questions about the Harlem Unity Night, about community concerns, about allegations, and her phrasing was careful, like she was offering Bumpy a chance to incriminate himself politely. Bumpy answered with practiced calm, speaking about Harlem's resilience, about youth programs, about dignity and self-determination, and he did it without raising his voice, forcing the journalist to listen instead of react. Elijah watched her expression change slightly, the way it changes when you realize your planned story doesn't fit the words you're getting. She glanced at Elijah, perhaps hoping to provoke him into something sharper, something more dramatic, but Elijah kept his face steady and his hands relaxed, refusing to be used as a headline. When they left, Bumpy leaned close and murmured, "That's one camera avoided." Elijah nodded, realizing tonight's danger wasn't a physical ambush, it was a narrative ambush, and narratives, in their world, could ruin lives as thoroughly as any street conflict.
As the event progressed, the microphone on the stage began to matter more. A host announced speeches, and donors were praised for their generosity, while certain community leaders were invited to say a few words. Elijah noticed something immediately. The list of speakers was carefully selected, and it didn't include the voices that had actually built Harlem's unity. It included sanitized representatives, people who would praise the system and call it progress. Elijah looked at Bumpy and saw it in his eyes, too. Lasky wasn't just attending, he was shaping the event to present himself as a partner of development, a man who could claim moral legitimacy in front of wealthy witnesses. Elijah understood the trap now. If Lasky could look like a public benefactor, then anyone opposing him would be painted as criminals resisting progress, and Harlem would be framed as a problem to be managed rather than a home to be respected. Bumpy didn't panic. He waited. He let the room perform its theater while he watched for the moment to insert truth. Elijah's heart beat heavier as the host announced a special recognition for Victor Lasky, praising him for supporting community initiatives. The applause that followed made Elijah's stomach turn because he could feel the hypocrisy in the clapping, feel how easily people applaud whatever keeps their conscience comfortable. Lasky stepped onto the stage smiling, his posture confident, and he began speaking about opportunity, about safety, about bringing order to neighborhoods that needed structure. His words were polished, but Elijah heard the cruelty under them. He was describing control as care. He was describing takeover as assistance. He was offering the room a story where Harlem's resistance would look like ingratitude. Then Lasky shifted his gaze toward Bumpy, and with a smoothness that made Elijah's skin crawl, he made the night personal. He referenced recent incidents in Harlem, spoke about violence disrupting peaceful gatherings, and said that certain influences were threatening the safety of community progress. He never said Bumpy's name, never said Elijah's name, but the implication hung in the air, and the room's attention turned toward them like a spotlight. Elijah felt the old anger surge, not because he was being accused, but because he was watching a liar weaponize safety against the very people who had been fighting for it the hardest. Bumpy remained still, but Elijah saw the muscle in his jaw tighten. Lasky continued, saying that some people hid behind community language while undermining community peace. Then, with deliberate theatrical timing, he added, "If we want real progress, we must be willing to remove the bad actors, no matter how popular they are in certain streets." The room murmured. Some guests looked uncomfortable, others nodded. Elijah felt the trap closing. Lasky had just painted Bumpy as an obstacle to progress, and if Bumpy responded with anger, it would confirm the picture Lasky was painting. This was the moment designed to push Elijah into reacting emotionally, because a single outburst could be captured, clipped, and spread as proof that Harlem's representatives were dangerous. Elijah inhaled slowly, and forced his body to stay calm because he understood what was at stake, not pride, but the community's credibility. Bumpy didn't stand immediately. He waited until the applause faded and the room's attention reached its peak. Then he lifted a hand slightly, signaling politely that he wanted to speak. The host hesitated because the night wasn't planned for Bumpy's voice, but the tension in the room made refusal awkward. Cameras swiveled, faces leaned forward. The host finally offered Bumpy the microphone with a smile that was too stiff to be sincere. Bumpy walked to the stage with slow control, and Elijah followed at a respectful distance, positioning himself where he could see both the crowd and Lasky. Bumpy took the microphone and didn't start with accusation. He didn't start with threats. He started with something that cut deeper. He started with the truth that everyone in the room pretended not to know. He spoke about Harlem as a neighborhood full of families, not a territory for projects. He spoke about children who needed more than speeches. They needed stable housing, safe streets, and honest investment. He spoke about how progress often arrived in black communities as displacement, wrapped in paperwork and nice language. He acknowledged that Harlem had problems. He didn't romanticize struggle, but he challenged the audience to understand that Harlem's problems were not proof of Harlem's inferiority. They were proof of long-term neglect and exploitation. His voice stayed calm, but his words landed heavy. Then he turned slightly toward Lasky and said politely but clearly that anyone who cared about community safety should be willing to support the people who already live there, rather than trying to control them from the outside. The room quieted. You could feel discomfort rising, because wealthy rooms don't like being reminded that their comfort has history attached. Lasky styled like he admired the speech, but Elijah saw the anger behind his eyes. Bumpy finished by saying that Harlem didn't need a savior. It needed partners who respected its people. The applause that followed was uneven. Some clapped sincerely, some clapped politely, and some didn't clap at all. But something had shifted. The room had been forced to hear a different story. Lasky wasn't done. He stepped back to the microphone with a measured laugh and praised Bumpy's passion, then implied passion could be dangerous when it wasn't guided by responsible leadership. He offered a small smile toward Elijah and said with a tone that made the hair on Elijah's arms rise, "And we all know what happens when certain individuals take protection into their own hands." The crowd murmured again. Elijah realized Lasky was pointing directly at the fundraiser incident without naming it, baiting Elijah's guilt, inviting him to react. Elijah's chest tightened, and for a moment the echo of that sharp sound from part one flashed through his mind, threatening to pull him into the old story, the story where violence defines the man. But then another memory pushed forward. Joe Louis telling him that his conscience was proof he hadn't become careless, and that what mattered was what he did next. Elijah didn't move. He didn't flinch. He stared steadily at Lasky and let the silence do the work. Lasky's attempt to provoke him into a scene failed because Elijah refused to give the room a spectacle. In that calm refusal, Elijah realized something powerful. Restraint isn't just personal discipline. It's a social justice weapon because it denies oppressors the narrative they depend on. Then, in a twist Elijah didn't expect, the room itself began to fracture in a different way. An older man, one of the donors, visibly uncomfortable, stood up and asked a question out loud, not to Bumpy, but to Lasky. "Mr. Lasky, these are strong claims. What exactly are you proposing for Harlem beyond speeches?" The question was polite, but it was sharp. Lasky answered with smooth generalities, but the donor pressed gently, asking about concrete commitments, housing support, youth investment, fair business development. Lasky's smile tightened. He gave answers that sounded good but lacked substance, and Elijah watched a few heads in the crowd tilt skeptically. Then another voice spoke, this time a woman who ran a small nonprofit downtown. She asked respectfully why Lasky's community initiative had tried to push out local leadership rather than collaborate with it. Lasky laughed it off,
but the laughter sounded thinner now. Elijah understood what was happening. Bumpy's calm truth had cracked the surface, and now people who wanted to believe they were good were being forced to reconcile their self-image with the possibility that they were applauding a predator. Lasky tried to regain control by turning attention back to crime and security, but the room's energy had shifted from passive applause to active curiosity. Curiosity is dangerous to manipulators because it leads to questions, and questions lead to accountability.
After the formal speeches ended, the event moved into mingling again, but the atmosphere had changed. People approached Bumpy with guarded respect. Some asked questions, some offered cautious support, some avoided him entirely. Elijah stayed close, scanning, because while the narrative battle had shifted in their favor, Lasky was still dangerous, and dangerous men don't accept public discomfort without looking for a private revenge. Elijah noticed Lasky slipping toward a side corridor with one of his men, and Elijah's instincts sharpened. He didn't chase, he simply repositioned, watching from a distance, because chasing is what Lasky wanted. He wanted Elijah to look aggressive. Instead, Elijah quietly signaled one of Bumpy's trusted people to keep eyes on the corridor, while Elijah stayed near Bumpy, protecting him without turning protection into a performance. As the night progressed, Elijah overheard fragments of conversation, journalists debating angles, donors questioning narratives, community leaders discussing partnerships, and he realized the event hadn't given them a clean victory, but it had created something more valuable: uncertainty in the minds of people who had been too comfortable applauding Lasky's story. That uncertainty could grow into scrutiny, and scrutiny could limit Lasky's ability to operate openly. But Lasky's smile remained, and Elijah knew that a man like that didn't rely on open approval alone. He relied on leverage. He relied on pressure. And pressure would come next. It came the following morning, when a young man from Harlem arrived at Bumpy's place with panic in his eyes and said the community center, one of the key spaces they'd been protecting, had received an official notice. It would be shut down for violations unless a large sum of money was paid within days. Elijah read the notice and felt anger burn through him because he recognized the tactic. It wasn't about safety, it was about choking the community's lifelines. The center wasn't just a building, it was where kids stayed off corners, where mothers held meetings, where unity turned into action. Elijah looked at Bumpy, expecting him to respond with fury. Bumpy instead responded with focus. He said, "This is the answer to last night. He couldn't win the room, so he's attacking the roots." Elijah asked, "What do we do?" Bumpy looked at Elijah and said, "We refuse to let him make this about fear." Elijah's mind raced. Raising money quickly was difficult. Fighting city systems was exhausting. But then Elijah remembered something Joe Louis represented: discipline, persistence, dignity under pressure. Elijah realized they needed a public act that was both practical and symbolic, something that would protect the center and strengthen unity at the same time. He suggested a community-driven fundraiser and public showcase, not in a small hall, not in a private room, but out in the open, where the neighborhood could participate, where media could witness, where Lasky's pressure would look like what it was, an attempt to silence community independence. Bumpy studied Elijah for a moment, then nodded. "You thinking like a builder now," he said. Elijah didn't feel proud, he felt responsible. Responsibility is heavier than pride, but it's also cleaner. By nightfall, word began to spread across Harlem again, not through official channels, but through human networks. Barbers, pastors, gym trainers, mothers, shop owners. People talked about saving the center as if saving it was saving their own dignity. Elijah walked the streets and saw something that gave him a quiet strength. People weren't waiting for Bumpy to rescue them or for Elijah to fight a villain. They were stepping forward themselves. A bakery owner offered to donate bread. A musician offered to perform. A coach offered to bring the kids to show their training. Even an elderly woman Elijah had once seen sitting silently on a stoop said, "I ain't got money, baby, but I can cook." Elijah felt his throat tighten because he recognized the deeper victory. Lasky's pressure was backfiring because the community was responding not with collapse, but with solidarity. That solidarity didn't make the danger disappear. In fact, it might make Lasky more desperate. But it changed the direction of the story. It made the battle bigger than Elijah's echo and bigger than Bumpy's reputation. It made the battle about whether Harlem would accept being managed or insist on being respected. Late that night, as Elijah stood outside the community center watching volunteers carry chairs and tables inside, he felt the old echo in his mind again, but it sounded different now. It wasn't just a reminder of what he'd done, it was a reminder of what he refused to become. He looked at the center's worn doors and thought about the children who would walk through them tomorrow. He thought about Reggie's determined footwork in the gym. He thought about Joe Lewis's calm voice telling him that strength is what you refuse to do. And he realized with a steadiness that surprised him that the world could keep trying to provoke him into being a headline, but he was choosing something else, a foundation, a shield, a man who turned pain into purpose and refused to let predators define the narrative. As he walked back toward Bumpy's place, the streetlights flickered, and somewhere in the distance a car engine lingered too long, watching. Elijah didn't panic, he didn't chase, he simply noted it, stored it, and kept walking, because fear is loud, but discipline is louder in the long run. He knew Lasky was still out there, and he knew the next move might not be a speech or a rumor. It might be something designed to break the community's hope directly. But then Elijah remembered something new. Harlem was no longer standing alone behind him. Harlem was standing with him. And when a neighborhood decides to stand together, even the most polished predator begins to realize that control isn't as easy as it looked in a room full of money.